Everyone. This is a long talk, so bear with me, but I think it's an important one because it gets to the heart of our relationship with nature, with biodiversity. We need to bear in mind that for 99% of our existence as cognitively modern humans, humans that us moderns could actually talk to, joke with, interact with, that we have depended entirely on biodiversity for all of our needs. And only in the last 1,000 years or even less have we become increasingly distanced from biodiversity. So I'm exploring the theme of when nature and culture were one by looking at the resources, notably the plant resources, and specifically the bulb resources, as well as the shellfish resources that sustained the evolution of modern humans along the Cape South Coast. Before getting into the meat of this presentation, I'd like to introduce some of the key players. We were an international team. I'm just showing some of the participants who were really involved in the research aspects that I'm going to talk about. As you can see from these two slides, we had lots of meetings that involved all sorts of people. But the issue of the resource base was really of prime interest to a few of us on the project. Here is Curtis Marion from Arizona State University, who's our paleoanthropologist, and really got the ball rolling by posing the question to us, how can we quantify the resource base which sustained these people? That's me there from Nelson Mandela University, and Haley Cawthra, the geologist from the Council for Geosciences in Belleville. Then Alistair Potts played a key role, as well as Karen Esler. She's from Stellenbosch University. Alistair's from NMU. Our marine person was Rob Anderson from University of Cape Town. And then we had numerous postgrads involved at various stages. Elzaan Singles on underground storage organs, Susan Botha on foraging return rates of plants, and then Jan de Vink, who worked in the intertidal and looked at the resource base of shellfish. This is a somewhat complex slide, so I suggest you pay close attention because it provides us with the timeline for which most of the events I discuss in this presentation are nested. Let's focus on the bottom panel. On the bottom axis here, we have time in hundreds of thousands of years ago. So essentially, we're looking roughly at the last million years at something that is called a time period that is called the Pleistocene. On the side axis, we have a proxy for temperature with higher up here, the top of the axis being warmer temperatures and the bottom being colder temperatures. First thing that's evident is that over this Pleistocene period, there have been every 100,000 years or so warmer periods, which are called interglacials. And we're in the midst of an interglacial now, a much warmer period than the vast majority of the rest of the time where it was colder. And these cold periods are called glacials. Now, the two species of Homo that we're dealing with is Neanderthal man and Homo sapiens ourselves. Once upon a time, there was a progenitor to these two species that occurred over the whole region in Europe and in Western Africa, Western Eurasia, and so on. And there was gene flow between the Western Eurasian populations of this Homo and those occurring in Africa and the Levant. However, after about 300,000 years ago, there was very little or no gene flow, and Homo sapiens evolved as a distinct species in Africa and Homo neanderthalensis in Western Eurasia. The first Homo sapiens fossils are found about 250,000 years ago in East Africa. Genetics, as we'll see in the next slide, define this period roughly from 200,000 to 100,000 years ago, which was a long glacial stage, defines this period as the origin point of our lineage, Homo sapiens. So as I said in the previous slide, recent population genetics research has been able to pinpoint when modern humans first emerged from that original ancestor. And without going into all the details, these are two papers, fairly recent papers, that make this point, is that modern humans emerged in southern Africa, not in eastern Africa, about 108 to 160,000 years ago. So that fits in with that period, 100 to 160,000 years ago. And this is amazing, from an effective population size of circa 9,000 individuals. So somewhere in southern Africa, there was a small founder population that diverged from its earlier ancestor and became the wise human, Homo sapiens. You need to bear in mind that this genetic data comes from sampling indigenous African populations throughout Africa. And it was found that people of Kusan origin in southern Africa were the most likely candidates for the emergence of modern humans. The best evidence of modern humans emerging in this period, what we call in Africa the Middle Stone Age, this 200 to 100,000 year period roughly, the best evidence comes from the Cape South Coast, from Blombos Cave, where Chris Henshelwood is working, Pinnacle Point, where Curtis Marion is working, eastwards to Nelson Bay Cave, and beyond to Classy's River in the east, which isn't shown on the map. It's something we have to remember is that since this was a glacial period, and during glacials the sea levels are low because lots of ice is bound up in the ice caps, there was a large area exposed off the existing Cape South Coast, an area that was roughly the size of the existing Cape Floristic region, about 80,000 kilometers. And this is the currently submerged Paleogallus Plain. And as we'll see later in this talk, this region was likely key to the evolution of modern humans in our region. Okay, now we want to have a look at some of the things that have been found in these caves, in these various sites along the Cape South Coast. And firstly, the research of Curtis Marion et al., who showed 165,000 years ago, people were bringing shells into their caves for aesthetic reasons. So this was a shell that had been picked up on the sand. You could see it by the sand blasting it had experienced, but it was nonetheless beautiful. It wasn't a shell that was discarded from a harvesting bout. There was also evidence of collecting shellfish in the intertidal, the first evidence anywhere in the world of that. And we know that to collect shellfish in the intertidal, you have to have a fairly good idea of how tidal systems work, which often means getting your cues from the sky at night. A fairly sophisticated, certainly cognitively sophisticated process is intertidal foraging. And then, of course, evidence of ochre pigment and extremely finely made stone tools. Ochre indicating that people were adorning themselves, which is a very good indicator of cultural modernity. Remarkable process that was unearthed, excuse the pun, with the work of also Curtis Marion's group, indicated that 160,000 years ago, people were taking bits of silkcrete, a rock type that is quite widespread on the existing coastal plain, and they would heat treat this silkcrete for a certain amount of time, and that was a precise engineering feat. So timing was of the essence, and then produce a rock from this process that was very easy to work as a stone tool, could be used to make extremely small bladelets. So essentially this is mineral beneficiation that people practiced 162,000 years ago. Quite a long chain process. You need to get the right fuel, wood, and the temperature has to remain more or less the same for a very long period in order for this process to be successful. West along the coast from Pinnacle Point, at Blombos Cave, which is near Still Bay, Chris Henshelwood and his team have made a remarkable discovery. What they found was evidence for an ochre processing workshop. In other words, they found a perlemoon shell with a rounded pebble inside it, as well as a bit of ochre. So this shell was used to grind ochre, and the ochre almost certainly used to adorn people's faces, which is really a hallmark of modern, of cognitive modernity. You know, both Curtis's work and Chris's work has demolished the myth that you know, really cognitive, or should I say artistic or abstract thinking only emerged in Europe among Homo sapiens 40,000 years ago, after they had migrated from Africa into Europe, and they sort of mysteriously got wise in Europe. But this is not the case. You know, back 100,000 years before those first rock paintings were done in Europe, Homo sapiens along the Cape South coast had already developed all of the major indicators for cognitive modernity. Extraordinary discovery from Blombos is the existence of a rock which actually had scratchings on it which almost certainly depict abstract drawing. So this again is another one of the findings that reinforce that people were doing all sorts of wise and wonderful things on the Cape South Coast a very long time ago. And then there's Charles Helm, of course, who's done amazing work. Charles is also one of our group, and he's been looking at the footprints left behind, or the tracks left behind by animals as well as humans, dating back to sand dunes that were deposited 130,000 years ago when the sea level was more or less as high as it is now. And people moved over these dunes, animals moved over these dunes, they made an imprint, sand filled up the imprint and with a different density. And of course, when the sand dunes became solidified, they started becoming a calcarenite, as we see here. These are calcarenites. They preserve these footprints, and Charles Helm goes in and he finds all sorts of fascinating things. So here is a human footprint found near Brenton-on-Sea, probably dating to 100,000 years or so. These are trackways of giraffe. So we've also learned all sorts of things about what animals were on the Paleogallus plain. And then one of the really interesting findings, Charles Helm, Haley Cawthra, and Jan de Vink are all involved here. One of the really interesting findings is this engraving on a piece of calcarenite. You can see there's a triangle like that with a line going through it. And that actually represents a fertility symbol that is still used today in many different contexts. So this was going back 100,000 years, and people were already capable of abstract depictions of certain phenomena that were of huge importance to them. So here we have a reconstruction of what the environment would have looked like on that Paleogallus plain south of Pinnacle Point. So in the background we see the caves, typical caves of Table Mountain sandstone that form the cliff faces of the current coastline, and this very flat plain that extended to the south of it would have supported grassland and large numbers of antelope, like these roan antelope here, being hunted by early modern humans. But our focus is not going to be on the mammal resources. Instead, we're going to really look at the plant resources, but most principally the bulbs, these plants with underground storage organs that provided the starch, the carbohydrate source for humans, as well as the intertidal fauna of shellfish, which was a very reliable and rich source of protein. So the balance between the underground storage organs with carbohydrate and the protein-rich shell food would have provided people with an excellent diet, complemented, of course, by times in which they could hunt large mammals and eat their meat. So this is another one of Maggie's depictions of life on the Paleogallus plain. Here is the coast. You can see the coast along here with the dune that's acting as a barrier to rivers getting through to the sea. So we have a form of wetlands here. These are the coastal plain. In the far distance, we can see the Cape Folded Belt of the existing coastline. Bigger river running down there. This is a grassy plain full of animals. These are giant buffalo here with the extremely wide horns. Blowbook. There were two species of springbok. There were all sorts of animals. We'll see some more about it. But look at the people bringing back prey, coming back from the intertidal. Processing some bulbs here, taking off the outer tunics of these corms of a babiana, applying face paint, and so on and so forth. So this is where and how we wired our brains. It was learning to live on the Paleogallus plain that offered all sorts of opportunities, but you had to be smart to exploit them, to learn which bulbs were edible and which weren't, and when to forage in the intertidal, and when the animal movements would bring large numbers of game near you. One had to learn all about pattern and process of biodiversity in order to survive. So the hypothesis posited by Curtis Marion was that down here in the Cape, which is hardly even mentioned in this diagram, which pretty much depicts the basic notion that modern humans, Homo sapiens, evolved here and then spread from here across into West Africa, and then finally into Europe and around the world, getting to southern South America only 12,000 years ago. That's the thinking until fairly recently. However, both the genetic and archaeological evidence suggests that cognitively modern humans developed in southern Africa from a relatively small population. And it was from southern Africa that people then moved out to colonize the world. And the hypothesis posited by Marion is that it was down here in the south where this unique array of resources was available to humans, and that enabled them to forage more effectively once they learned how to do it, and have more leisure time to develop technologies, and particularly technologies they developed were those associated with hunting, not only in terms of hardware, but also in terms of behavioral traits. So, in other words, how to collaborate very effectively. And it was this collaboration for hunting and the improved technology that was developed along the Cape South coast that enabled humans to so rapidly move through the rest of the world, conquering other species on the way, both human species and very, very many others. The irony of it is that when we were down here, we would have been regarded as a red data book species, but once we got clever and we were able to move rapidly through the rest of the world, collaboratively hunting, and that included hunting possibly other humans, once we had managed to pull that off, there was no stopping us. I want to take you back to this diagram that depicts time during the Pleistocene. We can see we're going back to about 450,000 years. This is the period around about 130,000 years ago when the sea level was much higher and things were much warmer. Then there was this glacial period, before the current warm period, which we call the Holocene, where we are now. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is the last glacial maximum, the period when sea levels were lowest, temperatures were lowest, and the Agulhas plain, the Paleogallus plain, was maximally exposed. So what I'm going to do in this slide is just again refresh your memory about how the Cape South coast changed between a full interglacial like now and a full glacial, which would have been the last glacial maximum roughly about 20,000 years ago. So here we can see the existing Cape Coast from Algoa Bay to Mossel Bay with the Cape Folded Belt and the steeply dropping coastal foreland. And this is at a full interglacial, so the sea is more or less where it is now. And here we see what it would have looked like during a full glacial when the sea level was much lower. Now, what we were interested in doing is modeling the resource base that underpinned human evolution on this Paleogallus plain. So what we intended to do was to create a resourcescape and use that resourcescape to deduce predictions for archaeological phenomena. So the patterns of biodiversity, the yields, that energetic returns that this biodiversity yielded for humans, and the ways in which animals moved, and so on and so forth. By understanding those, we would be able to predict a lot about human behavior, because humans were, after all, entirely dependent on this biodiversity. So a group of us got together and in 2 papers pretty much summarized our approach. And basically we wanted to build a paleo resourcescape as a hypothesis and deduce predictions to test using the paleo archives, what we find in caves, and modeling. So this is quite unusual in the archaeological sciences, because normally people find an interesting artifact and then build a story around it. What we were trying to do is describe the underlying selective regimes and then predict what sort of interesting artifact could be found. Okay, there's going to be a lot of information on this slide, but I'm certainly not expecting you to take it all in. But what I'm going to show you is how we built up this resourcescape. So the first thing we had to do, and this was done by Haley Korthra in a most remarkable study, was to map the geology of the Paleogallus plain. Okay, and that meant doing all sorts of things that I don't have time to go into now, but it was quite remarkable what Haley managed to achieve. As I said, this Paleogallus plain is extremely flat. You have these massive river valleys that meander across this extremely flat plain. This is the Goritz, which had a huge delta, and vast tracts of alluvial soil, rich soil in these valleys. And then the proximal part of the plain was underlain mainly by Cretaceous soils or Bockefeld soil. So in other words, yielded fairly fertile, Bockefeld rocks or Cretaceous rocks, which yielded fertile soils. And there were also large patches of alunite across this distal part of the coastal plain. Towards the west, there were patches of TMS, that outcropped. And then, of course, along the coast, there was large areas of calcareous dune deposits, as well as a big area of calcrete in the distal part of the plain. An important point to make is that the soils were more fertile on average than those of the contemporary Cape Floristic region. Indeed, the Paleogallus plain probably included some of the richest soils in the entire greater Cape Floristic region. And then if we look at temperatures, and this was from a climate model, extremely labor-intensive climate model. If we look at the temperatures in the present-day onshore and the Paleogallus plain, as predicted by the many different climate models used in this analysis, what's clear is that during the last glacial maximum, and that's the period that we were modeling for, daily maximum temperatures were 3 to 4 degrees Celsius higher than present in summer, and 2 to 4 degrees Celsius lower than present in winter. So the summers were warmer and the winters were cooler. It was a slightly more continental climate, but nonetheless, temperatures of 3 to 4 degrees Celsius higher is in summer during glacials is an amazing finding. And the Paleogallus plain was frost-free, which is really important. So it would have supported frost-sensitive subtropical flora. Then if we have a look at rainfall amounts in spring, summer, autumn and winter, what we can deduce is that there was more rain than present in the winter rain region and a slight eastward expansion of winter rain. So the winter rain area got more rain and there was a somewhat slight expansion, and there was more warm season rainfall in the east. So more summer, spring and autumn rain in the east. And then we took into account the effects of low carbon dioxide on modeling the vegetation. So the model accounted for low carbon dioxide and low water stress at the last glacial maximum. I'm also interested in fire. I mean, could the Paleogallus plain support fires? Because we know that fire is so crucial for Cape vegetation. Without fire, it would obviously be replaced by thicket or even forest in places, and that would mean a completely different resource base. So what we did is look at sites along the contemporary coast, as well as some sites on the Paleogallus plain, and we used the model, the climate model for the last glacial maximum, to get an idea about how different the fire climates were during the last glacial compared to now. And there's a lot of data here. Basically, you can see the LGM, and this is a fire danger index. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail taking you through these graphs, just to say the severity of fire weather during the LGM across the Paleogallus plain was significantly higher than at present. So it would have supported fires, and they would have been able to spread for great distances because there was very little topography to impede their spread. So the next challenge was to map the vegetation on the Paleogallus plain. Now we know that we can develop simple rules for mapping Cape vegetation. If you've got information on soil, rainfall, and fire exposure. Those three things enable you to, especially if you can ignore frost. Frost would be another important determinant of vegetation boundaries in this context. But we don't have to worry about frost, so we got fire, and we have climate, soil moisture really, and soil type, which enable us to develop simple rules to map the vegetation. So this is the national vegetation map, on the present day coastline. You know, that's all Renosterveld. There's mountain fynbos there, there's limestone fynbos, sand fynbos, etc., etc. And I think that is shale fynbos. We actually, first to test our model, we assessed how good it was modeling the present day vegetation. And it did a pretty good job. Overall, an excellent job. The only thing that it didn't do, or that it did, that the existing vegetation map doesn't do, is that it mapped a lot of the Renosterveld between Riversdale and Mossel Bay and up again towards Swellendam. It mapped it as grassland. And this is really interesting. Sorry, there's those bits that were mapped as grassland. And were mapped as Renosterveld in the national map. And it's interesting that the early travelers, when they traveled over the eastern part of the South Cape Renosterveld region, referred to it as the Blaugrasveld, referring then to the bluey hue of the Media Triandra, because it was a grassland and has subsequently was degraded and invaded by Renosterveld and other unpalatable shrubs. So we were very happy that our model could predict present day vegetation. And here is the outcome of the model for the last glacial maximum. And what we have is large areas of grassland on the proximal part of the plain, large areas of limestone fynbos in the distal part of the plain, alienite, old sand dunes all over the place, left over from previous sea level fluctuations, and a little bit of sandstone with fynbos and shale fynbos in the extreme southwest of the Paleogallus plain. And these valleys here were large savanna-like, supported large savanna-like formations, so-called Doringveld, dominated by Acacia karoo, that would have covered large areas. So let's have a look at some reconstructions of these habitats to get a better idea about what things looked like on the ground. The scene depicts a grassland which would have occurred on the proximal or northern part of the Paleogallus plain, underlain by rich soils and supporting a rich, presumably a rich flora of both summer and winter growing grasses with numerous bulbs and other forbs and odd shrubs scattered here and there. What's interesting really is the fauna that occupied this plain, this grassy plain. There were a bunch of forms that are now extinct. For example, the giant Cape horse or zebra, that's next to the quagga, which would have been widespread there as well. Also a giant hartebeest. We can see it next to the normal hartebeest in the background. There was a giant warthog here being pursued by the Cape lion with its typical mane of dark hair, and of course many other grazing species. There were 2 species of springbuck, there was bluebuck, there was bontebok. This was really a rich plains game, more typical of what you would find in the Serengeti. There were obviously many predators that in addition to lion, that followed these herds of animals that might well have been migratory across the plain, moving from the east in times of which gets more summer rain, moving from the east to the west when to pick up growth associated with the winter rains. And here is a scene depicting Doringveld, acacia karoo dominated vegetation, or should I say Vachellia karoo, in these vast floodplains that could have been up to 30 kilometers wide in places. And this habitat would have supported very much a bush or thicket kind of community. Obviously elephants. There would have been kudu, bushbuck, rhino, giraffe, and we have evidence for all of these animals being in the area by the footprints that they left on the dunes to the further south. Throughout that northern part of the plain with the grasslands, there would have been extensive wetlands, probably also in some of the big floodplains. And these wetlands had an intriguing fauna, many species of which no longer occur in the Cape. We can see right to on the left here is the giant Cape buffalo. It's extinct. You can see its extremely long horns, typical of the species, obviously adapted for open environments. There also would have been the normal Cape buffalo, waterbuck, which no longer occur anywhere near the Cape these days. Crocodile, you can see in the foreground here, of which there's evidence from footprints left in the sand dunes near Sedgefield. Hippos, Nile monitor, all sorts of wetland birds. These would have been extremely productive systems, more reminiscent again of what we would expect in subtropical to tropical Africa than on the Cape South Coast during a glacial. Part of the plain at full exposure, there would have been large areas of calcarenite or calcrete, supporting typical endemic rich limestone fynbos, Protea obtusifolia, Leucodendron, Meridianum, and so on and so forth. Dunes here, this is the dunes that would have formed just inland of the seashore, dune thicket at the base, and dune strandveld higher up. You can see a fire probably started by hunter-gatherers to promote abundance and apparency of the bulbs that they harvested here. Elephant would have been common, black rhino would have been common, little grysbok shown here. This is their prime habitat, caracal, Cape hare, so on and so forth. A fauna very similar to the one that we find along today's coastline. And then finally the beach, the Indian Ocean here, relatively warm Agulhas current. These are calcarenites, old dunes from the previous phase of deposition, seals on them. And here an undescribed species, a new species of tortoise, the parrot-beaked tortoise grazing on dune strand plants. Here we can see footprints of humans walking across the sand that would become preserved in the calcarenites. Weird little animals. They're obviously mole rats, but also other weird things like this Namakwa mole, which is currently only found up in the Richtersveld area and into southern Namibia. We've certainly got tracks of it along the Cape South coast, and probably an animal that was able to survive here because of the huge areas of shifting sand dune that used to cover the Paleogallus plain. So let's look at the resources that people depended on. Early modern humans on the Paleogallus plain would have depended on to sustain them during this glacial period. And we're going to start with the marine resources, notably the intertidal shellfish. The shellfish communities of the Indian Ocean along the Cape South coast are interesting in that they combine aspects of the diversity of the subtropical East Coast with aspects of the productivity of the upwelled West Coast. So you have relatively rich but also abundant marine intertidal resources. So let's have a look at some of the prey. Well, these included limpets of various source types, great diversity of limpets on the Cape South coast. Oysters, the giant turban or the olicroc was a very important prey source. Venus ear as well as olicroc, mussels, brown mussels, and then red bait. Now, a lot of these, or a feature of these marine mollusks is that they have omega-3 oils, which are extremely important in brain development. So children feasting on intertidal resources would certainly get a boost in that respect. So protein-rich, oil-rich, and particularly when their gonads are evident in any of these, the gonads are source of very high nutrients. What are the returns in terms of calories per hour that harvesters would get from the intertidal at different times of the year, at different tidal levels, and with different sea conditions? Obviously, harvesting the intertidal is best at a low spring tide with very small swell, but can you still get material or calories at high tides, and how does this vary? So in order to answer this question, Jan de Vink managed to assemble lots of local people in the Still Bay region who had experience of harvesting intertidal shellfish and got them to do hundreds of bouts of harvesting under different conditions. And the best, how could I say, explanatory variable or thing which explained the variation in return rate was tidal level. Obviously, sea conditions also played a role, but if we just compare return rate with tidal level, we get a fairly good relationship with the neap tides getting much lower returns than obviously spring tides, where the highest returns are achieved. So one was able to fit a curve to these data, and this curve was pretty strong. It explained a lot of the variance. And then in order to compare this to other foraging systems elsewhere in the world, where people have actually measured return rates, if we look at, say, Hadza woman harvesting tubers, these are hunter-gatherer people up in Tanzania. Well, obviously, even under some of the worst conditions, like here, down here, the shellfish harvesting is giving much better return rates. And then if we look at shellfish harvesting among the Kiribati in, I think this is somewhere in Asia, Southeast Asia, then shellfish, North Australian Aborigines, still not approaching what you're getting under the best conditions in the intertidal. And even bow hunting vertebrates, Achi people, those under the best conditions, the harvesting of shellfish way exceeds what people get from bow hunting vertebrates in the Amazon rainforest. So overall, in conclusion, an extremely productive resource, certainly compared to others, but only certainly compared to shellfish harvesting in North Australia, and bow hunting only exceeds them at very low tides. So the next question we wanted to ask is, how resilient are these shellfish to serial harvesting, in other words, repeat harvesting? And this is also from Jan de Vink's PhD, where he got in several places along the coast, he got foragers to forage for different times and at different seasons, again varying it up, to measure to what extent the resource was depleted. And it was done in such a way to eliminate the possibilities of species migrating from, say, the sides of where the experiment is into the experiment area after the harvesting was done. So let's have a look at some of the results. Well, this is a hang of a lot of data, and again, I'm not going to stress you with going through all of these panels individually, just to say that the highly mobile gastropod, the olicroc, made up 81.9% of the calorific harvest in this repeat experiment. It did in the other experiments as well. It was certainly the animal of choice. There's no evidence for depletion in either type of habitat or either foraging frequency. So whether you were looking on alienite or on TMS rocks, there was no evidence for depletion at all. Replenishment occurred within 2 weeks by repopulation from deeper water rather than the longshore environment. So our hypothesis is the animals came from deeper water and from a pantry there of a large population of olicroc, and then invaded the intertidal as space became available. Yeah, so basically very little evidence for depletion. Now we move on to resources associated with bulbs, which have underground storage organs. And these underground storage organs, bulbs, corms, rhizomes, or whatever, were an important source of carbohydrate for hunter-gatherer people in the Cape. And if we look at this graph on the right-hand side, we can just see how extraordinary the Cape was, or is globally, in terms of the incidence of species with underground storage organs. So here we have area of different Mediterranean climate regions of the world. That is, regions that receive their rainfall during winter and have hot summers, hot dry summers like the Cape does. And here we have a number of geophyte species. Now bear in mind that not all of these are edible, some are poisonous, but it does give you an indication of the relative sizes of the geophyte floras of these Mediterranean areas, which incidentally have the highest diversity of plants with underground storage organs amongst different ecoregions globally. And we can see the Cape is exceptional. Occupying a very small area, it has over 2,000 species of geophyte, compared to Australia, Chile, California, some of the areas of similar size, but less than, order of magnitude less the number of species. The Mediterranean basin, which covers a huge area, still has barely half the number of geophyte species as the Cape. Look at the kind of underground storage organs that we find in the Cape. Well, the first group we can see in this panel here, up here, are those species that have small corms. Corms are actually modified stems, and corms are surrounded by, as we can see in this Watsonia, by leaf bases. These we call corm tunics. So we have small corms and then larger corms. We then have tubers, which are also underground stems, modified underground stems, rhizomes, small rhizomes, large rhizomes, and then bulbs. In the Cape, the geophyte flora is unusual in that it is dominated by cormous species, followed by bulbs, then rhizomes and tubers. So up to 40% of the species in a local flora, of the geophyte species in a local flora, are likely to be corms. Nowhere else in the world is this found. The only area that comes anywhere near this is in California, where up to 15% of the species locally can be corms. Now, why am I going on about corms? Because as we'll see in the next slide, corms are the most nutritious and provide the highest energetic returns of all the USOs in the Cape and likely elsewhere in the world. So recent work by Elzaan Singels from University of Cape Town has looked at the nutritional value of the different USO types in the Cape, as well as difficulties associated with harvesting these plants. In other words, how deeply are they buried? How long will it take you to excavate them? What is the size of the corms? And then what is their nutritional content, as well as their anti-nutrient content, the amount of tannins or fiber that they have, which actually have a negative impact on nutritional value because of the difficulties of treating these underground storage organs to render them edible. Now, I'm certainly not going to take you through all these complex graphs. Let's just have a look at a summary of the data. Okay, so here we have underground storage organ type: bulbs, corms, small, corms, large, rhizomes, small, rhizomes, large, tubers. And here we have size. So how much are you getting after you excavate? Depth, how deep do you have to excavate? anti-nutrients, tannins and fiber, energy content and moisture content. And if we have a look at bulbs, they're generally quite small, but they're easy to harvest. They have moderate levels of anti-nutrients, not too high, which means that a lot of them might be edible without having to treat them. Energy content is moderate. They have very high moisture content. So bulbs might have been used as thirst quenchers, but only of modest energetic returns. If we look at small corms, well, they're very small, but they also occur right near the surface. They have almost no anti-nutrients, so you can eat them raw. Very high energy content. The percentage of starch, and even in some of them oil, can be very high. Moisture content is quite low, so when you excavate one of these, most of it is providing useful energetic returns. Larger corms, they're obviously larger, they bury more deeply, but they do have higher anti-nutrient content. So Watsonia bulb, it's unlikely that you can eat that without treating it, and we'll hear more of that later. But again, the energy content is very high, and the fact that these can be quite large means that these are some of the most, how can I say, would have been some of the most sought after underground storage organs by hunter-gatherers. And indeed, this is shown in the fossil record. If you go and have a look at caves, you find an abundance of Watsonia corms or tunics, as well as other smaller corms like freesias and some of the smaller gladioli and so on, which indicates that people did focus on them. Now, small rhizomes, they're still bigger than small corms and bulbs, buried at moderate depth, moderate anti-nutrient content, but energy content is quite poor, and moisture content can be high. Larger rhizomes, they really, although they're big, they have high anti-nutrient content. They have to be laboriously treated, ground or heated or leached or something, and the energy content is only modest. And then tubers are generally quite small. The depth at which they are buried is moderate. They have relatively high anti-nutrient content and high moisture content. Some of them, like Baru Siphias, are really sought after even today by people of Kusan origin, but rarely as thirst quenchers. They don't provide much in the way of nutrients. So Elzaan Singles, in her master's work, had a look at the abundance of USOs in the different felt types of the south coast, the area inland of Pinnacle Point and westwards towards Blombos. And she looked in Strandveld, Renosterveld, riparian, Doringveld, that sort of savanna I was talking about earlier, right on the dune cordon, on the semi-mobile dunes, limestone fynbos and sandstone fynbos. And what she found is that in all of the felt types, there are areas with very high returns. Okay, these are kind of hotspots. But to a certain extent, Renosterveld and Strandveld provided the highest returns, but you could find areas of fairly high returns in any of the felt types. And we've repeated this work for the east, or Elzaan's repeated this work for the east coast, the southeast coast, in the Tsitsikamma and Kocha areas, and also on the west coast. And a similar pattern is found there as well, that there are hot spots and cold spots, which would have meant that hunter-gatherers would have had to learn to find the areas where bulbs were concentrated. So highest abundance was found in Strandveld, Renosterveld, and the dune cordon, and there are hotspots and cold spots of USO occurrence. Sue Buerter went on to explore the actual returns that you get from these different felt types using harvesters or foragers, local people recruited to forage in different felt types over a large area of the South Cape coastal lowlands. And there's a lot of data here. I'm not going to go through these panels in any detail, but just summarize them by saying that other than in Renosterveld, there weren't any seasonal differences. So you got the same returns whether you were harvesting in autumn or spring or summer, which indicates that there's a year-round availability of USOs in this area. Hotspots are concentrated in sand, fynbos, strandveld, and riparian vegetation. So results a little bit different from what Elzaan found in the sense that riparian vegetation wasn't represented there. She obtained an overall mean return of about 141 kilocalories per hour, and we need 2,000 kilocalories per day to survive. So not bad returns, and bear in mind that these are mean values, whereas we should be looking at the extreme high values, because a clever forager would have focused on those and not gone to so-called cold spots. What Sue also found is that the highest returns of USOs were found in areas that were recently burnt. And you can see why. Here's a forager working in a recently burned area. It's open. A lot of the bulbs are very apparent. Many of them might be flowering. But here we see the same vegetation type, sand fynbos, that is mature. And foragers are now having to put in much more effort to locate USOs. Many of the geophytes could be dormant or under dense shrubbery, and so on and so forth. So these are the data from sand fynbos and limestone fynbos, and you can see post-fire vegetation age in years along this axis, and returns, whether measured in kilograms per hour or kilocalories per hour, were always highest in the younger vegetation. And this provides another reason, or one of the main reasons why people would have practiced fire stick farming, to clear the dense vegetation and make bulbs more apparent. So how did people process these USOs to make them edible? What sort of techniques were the most effective? And this is some work from Elzaan Singles' PhD. On the side axis, we have tannin content, which is a fierce anti-nutrient, interferes with digestion, tastes awful, so it's important to get the tannin out. We're dealing here, the species of interest is a Watsonia. Here we have the control, so it wasn't treated. Here we have the corms leached in a river, leached in the ocean, baked, ground, and collected after veld fire. And what is clear is that leaching in the ocean is far more effective than leaching from a river, from fresh water. And again, a lot of these early Stone Age people, or should I say Middle Stone Age people, were likely to live along the coast, and you just need to put those corms in a rock pool. Clearly, baking has an important effect, grinding the corms to get all the tannin out, but that's very laborious. But what is amazing, the best results were collecting corms immediately after a felt fire. So these are corms that are collected immediately after a felt fire. We can see them here, and that impact of that fire reduces all of the tannins in the corms. So places like this with a high concentration of, say, Watsonias would have been extremely important places for foragers, and they likely managed them, these areas, using fire, which may well have caused the population density to rise, but also would have provided them with a superb supply of starch, which they would have then ground into cakes or bread, which people carried with them when they went on hunting or other foraging expeditions. So like as we did for the intertidal shellfish fauna, we were also interested in whether one could deplete the USO populations in particular sites. And this was part of Sue Buerter's PhD. And what Sue did is take teams of foragers to exactly the same site for 3 consecutive years to see if she could detect depletion. And indeed, our hypothesis was that depletion would occur, that eventually, because corms are bulbous or species with USOs, most of them are relatively long-lived. They're not like annuals that make babies every year, that there would be evidence of depletion. Anyway, here's the data. So what we have on this axis is the total harvestable edible weight, and on this axis the percentage of the 2015 harvest, the first harvest. And what we can see is that only after the 3rd year do we get any indication of depletion. And similarly, in 2017, 3 years after the harvest, the initial harvest, you're getting almost 50% of what you got then. So depletion is weakly detected in the 3rd year only. One of the interesting things that Sue found was in some areas a whole new flora of geophytes would emerge. So if the people went there in the 1st year, they were harvesting a freesia, the next year a babiana would pop up. So the variation in emergence and flowering and apparency of geophytes from season to season, to a certain extent, buffered any impacts of depletion. So our work had focused very much on the south coast up until now, this area here, because it was inland of Pinnacle Point, Blombos, places that we were interested in. But we wanted to figure out to what extent are the patterns that we found here similar to those in the southeastern part of the Cape or the western part of the Cape. Both these regions are also important for Middle Stone Age, the evolution of Middle Stone Age culture. We have many sites on the west coast, Elands Bay Cave, Deep Kloof, and others that show Middle Stone Age archaeology, not as far back as we find on the south coast. And similarly, in the east coast, we have places like Classy's River and so on and so forth. So this was work from Elzaan Singles' PhD, and she went and sampled a whole lot of plots on the west coast, the south coast, and the east coast in the different major felt types that we can see shown up here, and in autumn, which is presumably the period when bulbs are least apparent. They're mostly in their dormant phase, and in spring when they are normally most visible. So there's a lot of data, and I certainly don't want to bore you with all of the details, but what we can conclude is that in terms of species richness of edibles, the sort of reddish color at the bottom are the inedibles, so just ignore those. But species richness of edibles, abundance of edibles, as well as biomass of edibles was highest on the south coast. And what's also clear is that cormus species, followed by bulbs, were most abundant at all sites. So that pattern is pretty much similar across the region. That cormus species, which give you relatively high, or certainly the highest returns on foraging, prevail right throughout the Cape Coastal lowlands. But this high abundance in the south coast is intriguing. And what it seems to be is that on the south coast, there's a high abundance of cormus species during the autumn months, which doesn't occur elsewhere, not even in the east coast, which gets non-seasonal rain. The south coast, it seems, because of its bimodal rainfall, there's springs in there peaks in both autumn and spring that has selected for bulbs that can be apparent during the autumn months. And interestingly, lowest returns were on the west coast, the strongly winter rainfall areas of the west coast. And there during autumn, there was virtually nothing available. So just to summarize then, corms dominate everywhere. The highest diversity and abundance of USOs is on the south coast, and highest biomass of edibles is on the south coast, mainly owing to high returns in autumn. So getting back to the point that Curtis Marion made way back in 2010, that there was something unusual about the resource base in the south coast, both in terms of the intertidal fauna as well as the USO flora, we've certainly shown here that as far as the USO flora is concerned, he was dead right. So we come back to our scene of Middle Stone Age people living on the Paleo-Gallus Plain, hunting blowbok, as we can see here, adorning themselves, ochre, collecting firewood, which is plentiful in this region, processing bulbs, bringing back shellfish, and so on and so forth. And at this stage of the evolution of Homo sapiens, we depended on nature for everything. Everything that we can see here comes directly from resources that are harvested in the wild. We know that exposure to wild nature is healing. There's so much evidence from all sorts of different spheres that make us realize that being in nature is good for us. But why have we forsaken nature? What has happened in the last couple of 100 years, say, that has really pulled us out of the natural world into the world of machines, artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth? Well, I'm going to speculate a bit here. I'm sure this is a very deep and complex question, and I can only scratch at the surface in the time available. The hypothesis that I'm going to put forward is certainly not mine. It's something that I've gleaned from reading the magnificent books of the polymath Iain McGilchrist, and I strongly recommend people to read these books or at least listen to his podcasts. Iain McGilchrist is someone who has effectively bridged the disciplines, the natural sciences, the physical sciences, the social sciences, the humanities, and these books are extremely well researched. Thousands of references, footnotes, and so on and so forth. What I'm going to be talking about is more the subject of his first book, The Master and His Emissary, but the same theme runs through his second, well, not his, these aren't his first and second books, sorry, but ones that deal with this, what I call the hemisphere hypothesis or the divided brain hypothesis. Now, thoughts about the divided brain go back a long way, that our brain is divided into two distinct hemispheres, and communication between those hemispheres is restricted to a small part of the brain called the corpus callosum that links the two of them, which is a feature only found in mammals. In other groups of vertebrates or invertebrates, there are no connections between these two hemispheres at all. It was always thought that the right hemisphere was the kind of emotional hemisphere and played a slight or minor role in decision making, and the left hemisphere was, the hemisphere that did all the work. That is clearly not true. So what McGilchrist showed is that these hemisphere differences are biologically ancient. They go back 600 million years of biological evolution. That they represent two different ways of attending to the world. So the left hemisphere is focused very much on grasping and grabbing. You imagine a bird foraging on the ground, seed-eating bird for seed. It's focusing on differentiating between a little rock, a stick, and a seed, classifying them, and once it's classified, this is a seed, it then transmits that information, represents that information to the right hemisphere, which then helps or ensures that it decides to actually consume that seed. Meanwhile, the right hemisphere is the one that's looking at context. It's looking at the bigger world. It's seeing whether there's a predator going to come swooping down and eat it. So they're two completely different ways of attending to the world, but we use both in everything we do. So you don't talk about that person's just left hemisphere and that person's just right hemisphere. There can be biases, obviously, and these biases can be determined by environments we live in, and most importantly, the cultures we live in. But we use these hemispheres for everything we do, and all the really important things like imagination, creativity, and so on and so forth are dependent on the inputs of both hemispheres. And our culture is becoming increasingly biased towards the left hemisphere worldview, and this is one of the disturbing conclusions of Iain McGilchrist's book, The Master and its Emissary. So here we have a depiction of a left hemisphere and right hemisphere. Let's have a look at what these different hemispheres are most adept at doing. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, the left hemisphere attends locally, the right hemisphere attends globally. It's the one who's looking at the big picture, the context. The left hemisphere, as I said, represents information to the right hemisphere, whereas the right hemisphere is seeing things as they are. It's not seeing a kind of a movie of what was happening. It's seeing actually what is happening. It's in the now. The left hemisphere is explicit. It wants everything written down. It wants rules. The right hemisphere is implicit. What we can't really put to words, but we know is true or right or good. The left hemisphere is rational. The right hemisphere is intuitive. And that's also a very important difference. We often think of the Enlightenment as the emergence of rational man, and indeed it was, but the Enlightenment also had downsides in that it downplayed intuitive thinking and it downplayed mystery and mysticism. The left hemisphere is abstract. It loves models and maps. The right hemisphere is embodied. It wants people. It wants to see the world as it is and not in an abstract way. The left hemisphere focuses on things, the right hemisphere on relationships. Left hemisphere is reductionist, focuses on parts, the right hemisphere on the whole. The left hemisphere is very much focused on use. How can I use that? Is it useful to me? Whereas the right hemisphere appreciates beauty. Knowledge in the left hemisphere, wisdom in the right hemisphere, competition and collaboration. So we can see these are very different worlds, either or, both and. So the left hemisphere represents a grasping kind of machine world. And we need that grasping machine world in order to survive, but it shouldn't dominate our culture and our thinking. The right hemisphere is associated with a more cautioned or cautionary connected world. We need both hemispheres, but the master should oversee the emissary, the left hemisphere. And what's happened in our recent culture, particularly since the Industrial Revolution and the emergence of this machine world where humans have seen themselves as this dominant component of the biosphere who can grab and exploit everything, that we are immune from nature, we are sealed off from the normal forces of life. This has created a massive disconnect with nature. And this, I believe, and I'm just really echoing McGilchrist here, is the source of our problems, is that since the Romantic period of the late 1700s, early 1800s, we have been embroiled in this increasing machine age that is disembodied, abstract, full of things, focuses on knowledge, is competitive, and very down the line, either or. That's very much a left hemisphere perspective. There can be no shades of grey. So in conclusion, let's look at this field of Watsonians and imagine how a hunter-gatherer would have seen this. As an extraordinary place that provides the staple carbohydrates that needs to be managed carefully with fire in order to maximize returns from the USOs, but also a place of beauty, a place that is sacred. Whereas today, in today's world, and this is somewhere in the southeastern Cape, someone would come, you know, who knows, a steel baron from Boksburg or whatever, trying to escape Gauteng, would look at this piece of land, realize there was a little river down in the valley there, he could dam it, and the abundance of Watsonia would indicate that this is a good place to establish pastures and engage in industrial scale farming. And that attitude, I think, has been influenced massively by the culture that we have developed over the last 200 years or so. So, in conclusion, what I would say here is that there are things here of great use but also of great beauty, and they are interwoven in myriad unspoken ways that demand our awe and reverence. And that would be the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere cooperating to give us a perspective that makes sense, that is sustainable, and that values the importance of nature. And even though the context we live in is very different today, we need to strive to get back to that way of thinking to ensure that we don't end our time on Earth in some cataclysmic way. Thank you very much.